The mechanics of saddling. Lynn Brown, saddle designer and builder, conducts saddle fit clinics in the United States and abroad. Through his Mechanics of Saddling video series, you'll learn about the physiology of the horse's back and how the muscles and skeletal system are affected by the saddle and the weight of the rider. You'll observe the proper technique for palpating a horse's back for soreness and how to assess the fit of your saddle. Lynn and Lisa Brown gained much of their basic knowledge about saddle fit on a 3,000-mile, 7.5-month horseback trip. This 1982 trip took them through 7 states, including the Rocky Mountains. Because of saddling problems they encountered and solved on the trip, the Browns returned home intent on making a better saddle. Thus evolved the Orthoflex Performance Saddle. They introduced the first patented model in 1986 and are now the largest custom saddle manufacturer in the United States. Since then, they've doubled their growth each year. Let's join Lynn once more at his saddle fitting clinic for the second segment of The Mechanics of Saddling, featuring discussions about the horse's equilibrium, saddle fit, and palpating the horse's back.
And now what we'll talk about is the center of gravity. We talked about the natural seat, which places the rider back in the middle of the horse's back. But the popular thing nowadays has become riding up and over the point of balance, or the center of gravity on the horse. And it's called the forward seat, which is really a misnomer. So if we go ahead and we put our weight back here, the first thing that I have people ask me, well, aren't I going to sore the loins, the kidneys? I'm going to sore the kidneys on my horse. A little look at physiology is going to tell you that the kidneys are way down underneath these real thick, heavy loin muscles and nowhere close to actual contact with the saddle. So forget about directly soring the kidneys. We do have a situation here that we have nerve meridians that run down the back that the acupuncturists use, and they treat problems in the hindquarters of the horse, in the kidneys, in the bladder, respiratory function, major muscle groups back here, a lot of different things that the acupuncturists treat because of these nerve meridians, which we may be deadening and interrupting the saddle if we're not careful. And you can certainly interrupt function of the kidney with a saddle, don't get me wrong. But do you actually sore the kidney? What often happens in that situation is that the saddle tree gets placed too far forward and up too high, and then we dig into this area and we cause extreme pressure and we interrupt function of the horse. Back in the 17th and 18th century, I think some people kind of thought that the center of balance or center of gravity on a horse was right in the middle between the two columns of his legs. But in the 19th century, we got enlightened and we figured out that if we really look at it mathematically, if we take a big spit and run it through this horse and we shoot him with embalming fluid or whatever and we totally stiffen the horse, which this has been done, by the way, we locate a point of balance, the center of gravity, in which the horse would turn evenly all the way around. This is his natural point of balance, or his center of gravity. And it not only lies in this plane, but in this plane, here to here as well, you know, as side to side and front to back. It is his point of balance. And this being assumed because of the bulk of the horse in front and him carrying 65 to 70% of his weight on his forehand when he's standing still, we're going to assume that this center of balance is right in here on this horse. And the first thing an English rider will always come up to me and say is that, well, hey, I can't ride that way. I've got to ride centered. That's not what Sally Swift meant. I'll guarantee you she's not talking about this direction on the horse. She's talking about the rider being centered. And they say, I've got to be up over my point of balance so I can move with the horse. And you'll see most Western riders trying to do this nowadays too, putting the saddle way too far forward. What we have here is we are moving this point. Instead of being in the middle of our columns of support, we're moving it forward because we know that this horse is carrying more weight on his forehand and his hindquarters when he's standing still. What happens if we put a rider over that point of balance? We simply put more weight on the forehand and we move the point of balance forward further. And the horse is no longer operating with his natural point of balance. He can be made to with enough collection, with him getting his hindquarters under him enough and bringing his front end up enough to shift the rider's weight back. But this is very unusual. So keep in mind that when we get on this horse, if we want to put our weight on the horse in a place that will make him retain as close to possible his point of balance or center of gravity, then we'll simply put our weight between his two columns of support, front to rear. Okay? And then your horse will operate more naturally. He'll be lighter on the forehand, which is what most people want. They don't want a horse heavy on the forehand. And he will be able to stride out, move more naturally, and even jump more naturally. It's very interesting that the forward seat we always associate with a man by the name of Caprile, which was an Italian army officer who popularized jumping with a forward seat. But Caprile, in his notes, which I have, said in there that he never wants to move the saddle forward enough to interfere with the shoulder action of the horse. And again, he says that natural collection in a horse will carry that weight in the middle of his back. So what we have to do is to realize that Caprile himself, who started the forward seat in jumping, never meant for it to be up here right against the shoulder blade and the rider to be completely over the front of the horse. But when you go over a jump, yes, he did move the rider forward, but in the stirrups, not where the saddle sat. Okay, so there's a big difference. This forward seat is also used in racing. And, gee, who knows when it was really developed? Probably by the Indians and by the barbarians and the Huns and everybody before them. But when we get into modern times and saddling, it really didn't start with Caprile. It started with a black American jockey that went to England and used it there to win races with. And then another jockey by the name of Todd Sloan popularized it in England. And he simply took horses that were not as good, okay? And he beat better horses with this horse that was not as fast, not as good as their top horses. He did this by altering the instability of equilibrium on the horse, by moving himself forward. And he made the horse run faster. And then this spread throughout Europe, and it finally got, to be universal in thoroughbred racing. Do you ever see pictures of people riding thoroughbreds, the old paintings where they're back in the middle of the horse and they're bounding out across the grassy racetrack and they're sitting straight up in the air? We think, man, how slow, how dense could those people be? Here we are. We know what's going on, and our ancestors were so dumb as to ride in a ridiculous-looking fashion like that. But they were running at least, most instances, 4-mile races on their thoroughbreds. A horse was highly prized, and they wanted to keep their horses sound. When you run a 4-mile race on a horse and you move the rider that far forward, we tire these gluteal muscles so much that they stop working properly and regulating the weight on the forehand of the horse. We also carry an excessive amount of weight now on the front of the horse because we have moved it up there purposely to make him run faster, and I'll explain to you how. But the horse simply slows up at a finish line of a long race, and he starts, quote, hobby horsing. Next time you see a thoroughbred race, you watch the horse that wins. He'll be the smoothest horse across the finish line. And the slower you get, the more they'll be up and down in front, losing time between the front and the rear. The front legs tiring and the loin muscles tiring in the rear because of an excessive amount of weight being placed forward, and that's why we have half to 1 mile races. It's because they can't go any further than that in that kind of position, even with just the weight of a jockey. So we talked about our point of balance. We talked about 65 to 70% of the weight being on a forehand of the horse and the rest being carried by the rear. But that's just when a horse is standing. As the horse moves faster, he tries to maintain his natural point of balance. But he has a hard time doing that. And weight is transferred to the front of the horse, and it increases in its percentage as the horse moves out faster and faster and faster. So the forehand carries a lot of the weight. A healthy set of loin muscles, back muscles, and hamstring muscles help to regulate this weight and to lift the forehand of the horse and keep it from becoming too great. But think of what happens when a horse is traveling at a strong trot and we have a 800-pound horse. We have a 200-pound rider. And we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of this rider's weight we have almost all of this weight on the front of the horse in a forward position, such as standing forward, standing up in the stirrups, leaning forward at a trot. And our horse is just doing a strong trot. If we carry somewhere in the neighborhood of 670 pounds, 650 pounds, excuse me, 70, we'd be at around 550 pounds or so of this 800-pound horse, like an Arab, on the front end if he were standing or walking, but all of a sudden we're moving at a strong trot, and we're carrying now about 80% of this horse's weight on the front end. Well, that's 640 pounds of an 800-pound horse. You add even 150 pounds of the rider to that, to the forehand, or the full 150, and you're up there with that horse carrying all of his weight on his forehand, being maintained constantly at a hard trot. And this is without taking into account the concussion factor, okay, which doubles the rider and the horse's weight when he's trotting. All of a sudden you see why we have lame horses. I mean, they come up really lame in competitive trail and endurance riding. And this is what I have to preach to distance riders, is don't stand up at the trot. But they say, I have to. My horse trots so big, I can't post him. And I say, turn that statement around. Your horse is not trotting so big that you can't post it. It's simply that you are leaning forward so far as to make your horse trot so big. And if you sit down, he doesn't trot that big anymore. He doesn't do the, quote, power trot that he has to do to maintain his equilibrium when you're not standing. And what happens here is a horse has equilibrium. He is at a state of equilibrium when he's standing here right now, and he's maintaining it. And I, right here, am maintaining my equilibrium. If I place this foot forward and I place it forward far enough, at some point I'm going to have to put my weight on it to maintain my equilibrium. If I just lean forward, okay, no longer is the weight in the center of my body. Right now, my muscles from my legs and up through my back, I'm standing on my toes, are keeping me from going forward. And if I lean far enough, I've got to put my foot out, catch myself, and that's what creates forward movement. You ever see your horse lean down as he takes off? Okay? It's helping create this forward movement. If you put a weight on your shoulders and you lean forward this amount, you can no longer stand here. You've got to take a step. And again, another step. If you're going downhill, you ever run downhill fast enough that you couldn't stop down a steep enough hill? Your point of balance, your point of equilibrium is out in front of you. You are at the max as far as your instability of equilibrium. So if we increase the instability of equilibrium in an animal, we simply speed him up. Okay? Or we can say it the other way. If we speed him up, we increase his instability of equilibrium. And again, thinking of the weight on your back, if we put the weight on his back forward, then he's heavier on the forehand and he has to run faster to maintain his balance and his equilibrium. We have increased his instability of equilibrium. We put this through to the max in a racehorse. Do you ever wonder why that the more you pull on a horse that's running away, the faster he goes? It just doesn't work to just pull because he just runs harder and faster. You're transferring your weight through the range to the tip of his nose as far forward as you can get, and this is how we use a racehorse. We teach him to pull against the bit. It transfers weight forward, and now he runs faster than the horse that's better than him with a jockey sitting straight up and down in the middle of his back that's maintaining his integrity, physical integrity. The other horse outruns him. And you know what happened in thoroughbred racing after that. Horse that runs fastest wins, and whatever you have to do to make him do it, you'll do it. And we have a tremendous number of lame horses to deal with. If I have a saddle that's a little wide for a horse in front, or I have a horse that runs downhill, and my balance point on this horse is something similar, this tree just doesn't show it well enough. Too much curve in the seat. I have a balance point that makes the rider put his weight in the stirrup, whether it be to ride long in the stirrup and support his weight through his feet and legs, or whether it be to push himself back into the more comfortable part of the seat, which is always a little behind him. Either way, the weight is transferred forward into the saddle tree, okay? And we have a situation then that is very uncomfortable for the horse because almost all of our rider weight's being carried on an area here to here in the front of the saddle tree. And we create a tremendous amount of pressure and pinching, like we talked about earlier, and hollowing of the back. So before we can balance a rider and have a balanced rider, we've got to balance our saddle. Most people balance saddles by shifting it front to back to where they're most comfortable when they get on. Think about it. Isn't that the way you put your saddle on a horse? That's the way I always did it. Why would I want to put my saddle way back here and be uncomfortable? Besides that, it really is bad for the horse. So I'll move it up here to where I sit comfortable and I sit balanced. I don't have to push against the stirrups. And I ride, and I'm, quote, now over my point of balance as well. All of this kind of goes out the window when you consider enlarged shoulder blades for muscle that was repeatedly bruised, and that internal bleeding being interrupted again by bleeding internally, and a permanent fibrous enlargement taking place on the shoulder blade. Okay? And then it kind of pushes the saddle back, and the saddle ends up sitting behind it on this prominent shoulder at that time. Not that some horses don't have prominent shoulders without this, but this often happens. The other thing that we do when we move our saddle forward is we end up raising it up in front. Sometimes too much, and I see a lot of this. The more pads you put under this saddle, and the way the rigging is made to hold it in place, it often is made to ride too far forward. Padding, when we put on a half-inch padding, we raise the saddle in the back a half-inch. We raise it in front 3/4 of an inch. Because in front, we added weight to an arched surface, and we added a layer on a 45-degree angle here of a half-inch, and a 45-degree angle here of a half-inch, and we raised this saddle more than a half-inch in front. So we raised our saddle in front as soon as we put the padding under it, and pretty soon your rider can get to where he is back here against the back of the saddle, the cantle. He's being pushed against it, thrown against it, and you can see what it does to the horse. Initially, saddle trees were built more like the traditional Western saddle tree than what you see in an English saddle tree, which we'll show you in a minute. From time immemorial, when we first found out that they made a saddle tree, It was 2 paddles of wood set one on each side of the horse's spine, and this helped to keep a man's weight off of the very top of the spinal processes in the area of the vertebra itself, because we have an arch, a brace as you might call it, in what we call a fork in the front and in the cantle in the back, which hold these 2 paddles in position. A little bit of everything's been done with a saddle to try to make it fit a horse better, including putting a hinge in here, ball and socket joints, hinges in the bars themselves, ball and socket joints in here, and so on. A little bit of everything has been done in this manner by the military to try to fit a horse better, because we talked earlier about the military having so many problems with saddle fit, and in a long campaign, a long forced march, losing tremendous number of horses. So they really were the leader in the field in trying to come up with new ideas, but it also had to be easy enough to make that it didn't cost them an arm and a leg to provide them, and they also had to be easily worked on in the field. Most of these saddles went by the wayside. There are still a few of the saddles with the hinged bars in the tree in production. The problem being is coming up with a right angle here to match the angle we have back here, because this hinged bar still has a defined amount of twist in it. See, when we talk about twist in a saddle tree, we're looking at having to turn in front to match this arched surface, okay? It's a very inclined surface. We're having to have a very sharp angle there, and then the bar has to twist in order to flatten out for the back of the horse. You see what I mean? From here to the amount of flatness we have here is your twist in the bar. Now, I want to explain to you why you kind of get what you pay for in saddles. This saddle you pay anywhere from $500 to $700 or $800 for when you buy it. The saddle tree sells for $30, completed the way it is now. It's under a lot of name brand Western saddles, and it's under some of the most popular and oldest endurance saddles, and still being marketed today. They take a more finished version around to show to tack shops. This is what their saddle tree looks like, but this is what goes in the saddle, and I know because my tree maker makes them. They have a production shop, and we buy trees from the custom shop. The twist that's in this bar is cut with as much twist as can be cut from a piece of commercial lumber, 2 inches thick. It costs more money to laminate on another block of lumber in the rear and the front, to put a proper amount of flare in the front and rear, plus the twist to come back and fit the horse of today. This saddle might have fit a horse, or a lot of horses, let's say, 100 years ago. That's when this tree pattern was probably developed. But when we put it on a horse, and this is an unusually wide horse, so it's not a real fair sampling. See, we come close to fitting the angle in front even on this horse, but we're nowhere close to fitting the flatness in the rear. If we put this back here, just so that you can see what it fits on a larger, flatter back that we'll see in a lot of today's horses, only the rear edge of the bar is making contact. Even in endurance horses that we put this on that are fairly lean and mean, we carry no weight on the inside half of this bar from here up. We simply dig in on the outside edge. You'll see this on a lot of saddle trees. You go and buy a saddle from somebody like Ray Holes, and you've got a 2-year waiting period, and the starting price is up over $4 grand. He makes his own trees. You don't get something like this. See, you have Western tree makers out there that know exactly what they're doing. They just can't build enough saddles to satisfy the marketplace, so they put a price on them that only someone that's extremely serious would even consider to walk up and pay. And production trees, there are a few of them that are getting better, but you're going to pay more money for your tree, and you're going to have a pretty expensive saddle. I say production trees. Really, you're going to get a proper tree most of the time if you pay for it and know what you're asking for in a custom-made saddle, and a saddle tree is going to cost you some bucks. You're not going to get it for nothing. You're not going to get a $60 or $70 rawhide covered tree as would go in a production saddle and get that twist in the bar that you want. This is a production tree. Okay. Most people would set this tree up here, as we talked earlier. And again, not only do we have to be concerned with the twist in the bar, but we have to have a pretty generous amount of depth of sway in the middle of the bar. Okay? So that the ends of the saddle tree don't contact the horse. And I guarantee you, this is a tough horse to fit. Right now, I've got a hand space of daylight underneath the middle of it, and I'll guarantee you this tree has more depth in it than a lot that you'll find. This is going to be more the average that I see on production trees right here. Okay? Now, you see what you're covering up with all these pads a lot of times. This saddle tree doesn't fit on any Arab I've tried it on at all. It could fit a very narrow, very straight, and very level back without too wide a shoulder. The little horse we had in here earlier, it still had a little daylight underneath there. I was looking at saddle trees on John Lyon's stallions, and I thought it was kind of funny the way John looked at it. I said, well, this one doesn't fit. It was our trees. I said, this one doesn't fit too bad, John. It's just got a little daylight under it, just a little bit. And he said, what's the difference between 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 a mile? It's all air, you know? So you're still going to dig in front and rear if you're not making more contact in the middle than you are the ends. You have to make this contact in the middle because just look at the surface we're setting on here. This is a softer surface, particularly if we have this horse saddled properly and this muscle is quiescent and one side of it is working at a time. This is a softer surface than what we have up here and usually back here. So this saddle is going to sink in a little in the middle. And we've got to have a little depth in the bar or the tree itself. We start to get a fit. Okay? Now I'll explain to you 2 reasons why we start to get a fit. We come close now. And that's because this is the shortest saddle tree, Western type on the market. Turn your horse's head that way just a little bit. Yeah, yeah. Turn her that way a little more. Come on, baby. Body. There we go. See, so we start to set down into this horse's back. We also have a tremendous depth of sway, and we also flare at the edges. If this is one of our saddle trees, and it goes under the competitor, and it shows you how far we can go on horse conformation and still obtain a fit. If this saddle were being used without our spring panel skirting system, it would have to have even more flare on the ends. All right? Our spring panels keep these ends from digging into the horse. But we're talking now about fitting up a regular saddle. We're not talking about fitting up an Orthoflex at this moment. And I would have to have even more flare on the ends because if I don't, I start to carry a little too much contact on those ends. All right? You put a rider's weight in here and you do this a little bit and you can see what happens to the horse. It just moves with it. Okay? You put a rider's weight up here and you can see that you're going to dig with this amount of contact. So the flare has to be even more generous than this. The skirting system prevents this from digging in. And it spreads the weight on out in a flexible manner, which we'll show you in a little bit. To get back to a regular tree again, I want to show you, oh, this one's so exaggerated. We'll try to get something that fits a little better here. I'll try to show you something here. Come on, girl. Come on. That's a good girl. Oh. Now could you stand on that side of her? We're going to place this where most people would place a regular western tree. Would you turn her head and neck only? And I'll push up against her side here. Just turn her head and her neck your way. Okay? You see what happens at the front of this tree? You see why the horse does not want to bend for us. Normally, I would like to have a horse that simply bends. Now just try to get her to bend her head and neck. You see the bulging that takes place in the muscles? Those muscles will fill up a gap that's this wide. Okay? If I move the saddle tree back, bend down. Bend down. We still can dig in. So no matter where you put it, if you don't have a proper amount of flare in the end of this tree, you simply dig when the horse tries to flex and bend. And it cannot. It becomes very stiff. A lot of times it will not work on one side for you alone, preferring to bend on the other side. Even with this tree, okay, go ahead and turn her head and neck some. She can bend, but you see it's starting to dig. It's a very wide horse. And its tree would have to be custom fitted to this horse to make it work. Now, the spring panels going onto this tree will let that bending take place right here, and the panel will flex outward. And the tree will ride back of the shoulder blade. And when I say spring panel, I'm speaking of the spring that's inside here. You see what I'm talking about right here? That's why we build a very short saddle tree, and there's actually a large flat spring in here. We'll show it to you under the English saddle in just a moment. These move with the horse, and the tree is wide enough and has enough flare that they can continue to flex even beyond the tree itself. And that's one of the main components of the Orthoflex saddle. That's why we've built it to work the way it does. It can change angle, and it can bend and move with the front and the rear of the horse that is moving and changing shape. When you don't have that, if you want to fit this horse, you've got to have a proper amount of flare. We're almost getting that much flare here, but it could still come up and off the horse a little way. And right here, the bar would have to drop in and flatten from even a more of a flattened angle and swing out with quite a flare. Now this does something I want you to think about. If we build a saddle tree like that, what's to keep it from slipping forward? If you're roping, what's to keep it in place? What holds it on a horse's back now? We only have two things that hold the saddle on a horse's back in the downhill or in a roping situation. Either one. And that is the shoulders and the elbows. Otherwise, the saddle will go right off the horse's neck. Most people don't use a crupper or a breeching on a horse because they've got a saddle tree that digs in behind the shoulders. Okay? And they catch it. But these poor mule riders don't have any shoulders. So they've got to use something. They've got to use a crupper or a breeching. A breeching being a band that comes right across here and attaches to your saddle, right down in here to the rigging. And a crupper being usually a molded leather strap that goes around the tail right here and attaches to the saddle in the center. So this keeps the saddle from sliding forward. And it works for roping. It works for roping as well as it does packing and working a horse downhill. Because you anchor off something back here that can take all the way to that bull and actually help the horse tuck his hindquarters under to hold the saddle in place. If we build a saddle that really fits a horse, then it's not going to dig in to this shoulder blade. Some horses do have a naturally wide enough shoulder to even hold our saddle back with the spring panels that are pushing against the shoulder blades, but you're still carrying all of your weight and the saddle weight on those shoulders as they rotate back when that horse is going downhill. When you toss a rope and your horse slides, puts on the brakes and slides, you're carrying all the weight against shoulders that have to rotate out to make that horse stop. Okay? The foot swings out, the shoulder blade rotates back. All right, so if you anchor to something, you save your old horse's shoulders up here. And this is why a horse will sidestep in a downhill. We've got a saddle tree that's digging into that shoulder. A mule rider can't get by with that in a lot of instances, so he has to have a breeching or a crupper, because the next thing that catches, it's the elbow. And they don't want to cinch sore the mule. It's that simple. You can't get away from gravity. I don't care what horse it is. If you have a saddle that now fits and doesn't catch, you need it. Okay, if you have a slick shoulder on your animal, you need it. In any instance, you don't want that saddle catching the shoulder blade and eliminating the free rotation of it, because the horse needs to be able to use it. A little word about breechings and cruppers. A breeching is, like I said, a strap that comes across the hip back here, the thigh, right in here. Think about it. If you want to hold a saddle back and you're going to go down a steep hill, the horse has to tuck its rear end under it to go down the hill, and you loosen your breeching. We travel for 3,000 miles with breechings on our pack saddle. We stopped at the top of every good-sized mountain, tightened them up, stopped at the bottom, and loosened them up so the animals would not gall while operating on the flat. Okay? That means that they're a lot of trouble. They only work when you get off and adjust them to go down the hill. And I'll guarantee you I know that. You'd think after 3,000 miles I would have figured out something better. But it took me a few years after that. We're just real slow when it comes to basics. I am. It took years to figure this stuff out. People knew it before I did. So now I really go back and look in history as much as anything to figure out what has worked in the past and why. A crupper, on the other hand, as soon as you put a crupper on the underside of this horse's tail and you put a little pull against it, the horse will usually drop its hindquarters. It will tuck its rear end under it. But let's say that doesn't even happen because the horse is very comfortable and used to the crupper. When he goes downhill, he tucks his rear end under him. Okay? It's an automatic tightener. And when he's on the flat, it's loose. It's not tight enough to gall him as the breeching would be. So it works. Crupper works very well. One of the biggest problems with a crupper throughout history has simply been that it's very easy to sore the underside of this tail. It's very soft. It's very slick under here right now. It's satiny in its finish. And Lisa, would you hand me the crupper off the back of that saddle? It's like I tell people, I don't insist that you buy one of our cruppers. It's just that we make the only one that won't sore your horse's tail. This is tube neoprene wetsuit material. It has the diving suit nylon bonded to the other side of it, and we put the side that goes against the human skin on the outside. We use this for girths, breast straps, and cruppers. And the most important use for it is as a crupper. It is the most non-galling material you can find, and if you feel it, it feels just like the inside of the thigh on the horse. And it absorbs 6% moisture. It gets slightly wet, in other words, just slightly, enough to get slick. And most of the soring all the soring that you see in galling comes from friction. And the amount of friction you have, in other words, the friction coefficient's determined by how much movement you have and the roughness of the surfaces rubbing together. And enough roughness and enough movement, and you'll burn that animal, okay? You'll rub the hair off of him. You create enough heat inside to have heat bumps. Or extreme soreness in the loins like we saw in this other horse, caused from movement. This material right here is so good, its friction coefficient is so low that you can take a horse that's been sored with a leather crupper, turn around and put this on, and the hair will grow back. Everything works great while you're using it. So crupper works extremely well. There is a crupper available now that does not give you the problem of rubbing under the tail. Saddle trees, as we said, need to be built not only with proper amount of twist for the average horse, but they have to have a depth of sway in the middle. That means they end up being cut out of a 3 to 4 inch thick piece of lumber. That costs some dollars to do, and it's worth it. So that's what you want to look at when you look at a saddle on the underside. You see a visible difference between that and this, the amount of sway that we have here. This is one of our saddle trees. Our trees for ages have been covered with rawhide to strengthen them. It's a rawhide covered tree, but you have problems, and that is that you have to drill holes to tie in a lot of the rawhide, and also you have to run a lot of staples in the trees to hold the rawhide, and a lot of that is right on a stress line. You can create a stress line crack. A rawhide tree is a good tree, but what we prefer to do that gives us more of a license to create the shapes we want is to cover the wooden tree. In this case, this is yellow pine. We cover it with about 3 to 4 layers of fiberglass cloth and epoxy resin. And we laminate a ground seat into it. And this creates a double reverse arch, which is extremely strong. It makes the thing a unit at this point. Whether we're doing a western tree or one of our newer style western trees like this, which you'll see is quite thin through the bars. Okay, gives you nice close contact to the horse. You can't do this with a rawhide covered tree and use it for anything. You can rope with this tree. It's guaranteed for life. So this gives us the ability to put the rider closer and keep a very strong saddle. It's one of the things we do. You'll notice these stirrup loops. This is something new that we do for our western saddles. It's not a new invention by any means, but we do it to keep the stirrup strap from going up and over the bar of the tree, and the underside of the stirrup strap that comes through here from rubbing back and forth and creating heat in the horse and simply soring him from rubbing and pressure of the stirrup strap with heat. This is one of the most common places you'll see white hair on a horse, right in here, from that stirrup strap where it rubs and pulls and presses down against the horse, particularly if you ride without too much padding. Padding, thick padding, insulates the horse from that. Now, when we get into English, western saddle trees have not really changed since time immemorial very much. We get into English saddle trees, we have a completely different development. It's an English model, built in England, cut back, show seat, flat seat, whatever you want to call it. It's made out of layers of laminated wood. You can see it has probably 100 tacks in it. And it's really a pretty strongly made tree. It does have iron bracing throughout this area. It doesn't have any here. You don't want your horse to step on it right there. But other than that, they're quite good as far as strength goes for what you're going to do with it. But you can see that this tree is essentially extremely flat as far as the amount of sway that was built into this bar. It's as flat as all get out. It was never made to fit a horse. This is a different kind of saddling system. And the Aussie saddle follows the same system as this does. It's basically English in its construction. That means that what you fit the horse with is the padded panel that goes underneath this bar. And you eliminate the pinching in front by changing the thickness of your padding as you come forward and making it fuller in the middle. And you do the same in the rear. And you spread the padding out over a wider area than this bar does right here, so that you carry your weight on the horse over a larger contact area. Unfortunately, it's become very popular in the English field to have little bitty French panels. And they're very small. They don't carry the weight over a larger area as they should. But back to the English saddling system. Come on, baby. Turn her around. That's good right there. You can see that without a well-stuffed panel on this saddle, there's no way it'll fit the horse. Can you see this from over there? Unfortunately, we're bridging, and that is carrying weight front and rear. And we're going to cause pinching in the front, soreness in the horse, in the trapezius and the longissimus dorsi, dorsal flexion like we talked about earlier. And no more is this horse going to trot out freely with his back being bent and straightened while the muscles are trying to expand those vertebrae. And that, again, is what transmits this power through the horse. It's the opposing action of bending and straightening. So the horse's back changes very little, but the power is transmitted through. Our horse is going to hollow his back if we have bridging, because it's going to create pinching in front and digging in the rear. And you may get by with an hour or two pleasure ride on a weekend with this, but you won't get by with it when you start using your horse seriously. What I see in a lot of English saddles is I see some kind of a foam pad or a flocking that's put in here and stuffed, an even thickness throughout for a production saddle. It doesn't fit the horse any more than the tree does. These saddles were designed to be restuffed to fit your animal every year, if not every 6 months if needed. The saddle was developed in England when the royalty only owned horses and rode astride. And they had the wherewithal to go ahead and have their saddle fitted whenever it needed to be. And these panels were stuffed with hog's hair, with very firm straw, whatever was necessary to keep the integrity of the shape that they wanted to put into it. Think about it. You see the ads saying, we have wool flocking that molds to fit your horse. No. The areas of excessive pressure don't mold to fit the horse. You simply have excessive pressure in this area and nothing shifts to mold and fit the horse. You have to fit the horse with a very firm panel in the first place. If it molds to fit the horse, then why in the same manual does it say bring it back next year for restuffing? Okay? Because they do. And don't let anybody pull your leg. You can take your English saddle and you can stuff it and you can end up with a good fit. And all you have to have is enough width in the front for this bar to clear right here, the shoulder area. Now, we can make this work on this horse because when we raise it up, we widen it. Come here and stop pushing on me, sweetie. That just means that we're going to have to add more in the middle to make our contact. And we're going to have to make it quite firm. I had an argument with the distributor of a major brand English, actually German and Swiss saddle company a while back. I turned over a number of these new saddles. I said, explain to me why these are soft in the middle and hard on the ends. Oh, he said, we fit them to plastic horses in the factory and we've got all this figured out and that's the way it's supposed to be. And this man does saddle fit clinics too. And I said, well, tell me how, if it's soft in the middle, because see, they stuff these panels from the middle toward the ends. I said, if it's soft in the middle and hard in the ends, what keeps you from carrying an excessive amount of weight on the ends? Oh, that's the way it's done. We've been doing this for hundreds of years. Well, 10 years ago, they weren't done that way. Because I know some very high-quality English saddle shops that sell you the saddle and say, bring it back in a month, and we'll restuff it, and we'll make it firm in the middle, and we'll see where it's squishing out here, you know, and then we'll firm up the middle of this bar. So there's lots of things that take place out there so long as you, the public, let people sell you on it, and you use it, and you don't determine whether it works or not. You got to know what you're looking at. It's like getting horseshoeing done. If you want a good job, you almost have to know something about horseshoeing, because then you can get the kind of job you want done. The English saddle was really one of the most highly developed saddles we've ever had, but it takes personal attention to fitting to the horse. Very difficult to fit a regular saddle tree to anything more than one horse because of what you've seen and the amount of sway that we have to have take place in the bars, the flare on the ends so that we do not dig in. All of this is a very important factor. If I drop the saddle in front and make it low, which I'm going to move back just to show you for illustration purposes, it's as if the stirrup were hanging from up here, and it makes the rider want to slide forward in the seat. You get the feeling that the rear of the saddle is pushing you. Okay? And that's a very bad feeling, so a rider will do a number of things in this situation. One is ride with a very long stirrup right over the front of the seat, almost standing in the stirrups. Or the other is to push himself back into the comfortable part of the seat, and his legs almost always come forward a little bit, and he has a tremendous amount of pressure in the stirrups. Either way, you carry an excessive amount of weight on the front of the horse. I see a lot of saddles being used. Just over a little here. Come on, buddy. That's it. See a lot of saddles being used, hunt seat, and they're used well up on the shoulder, okay, like this, and because the rider's now thrown back, or they're used right up at the very back of the shoulder, the rider's now thrown back because the stirrup swings back, and it's as if we draw a straight line up, the stirrup leather were hung from here, and he's thrown against the cantle all the time. So they're using their saddle too far forward. Now they'll put a wedge pad under it to lift it up and balance it. Okay? It's really not necessary, and you still have interference with the shoulder. So whether it's an English saddle or a Western saddle, the same basic geometry holds true. This saddle seat has to be comfortable for you to sit in and for that horse to walk, and you be comfortable while you're just sitting. And then at a slow trot, you have to be comfortable while he is trotting. While you sit in the seat, you should not have to push on the stirrups or stand over the stirrups, or you quite probably are out of balance. And this balance is very key. It's very important. What happens when we move too far forward on the horse is let's go back with a typical English tree here. When we move too far forward on the horse, we end up to a certain amount locking into the movement in front, which is very little side-to-side movement, okay? And we're thrown back against the cantle, and we have a pressure and a movement problem back here because we're locked into the front of the horse somewhat, and the rear of the horse moves back and forth under the saddle more, and these shoulders push this saddle a lot at a walk so that we have movement like this. This happens on Western saddles, English saddles, you name it. Okay? If we want to eliminate that and we move our saddle back, we get our saddle back to where it's fitting a little better, and we are low in front, which is quite often the case. It's hard to show you with this horse. See if I have something here that would get low in front. This saddle tree is a little different than the other one. Okay. Say I move it back here to where it should set. It could be very easily be so flat that the rider's thrown forward. You have to lift the saddle. You have to do a little creative padding. It's called balancing out your saddle. You take lessons at a very sharp school or with a very sharp instructor. You present your school horse in the morning, and if your saddle on that horse is not balanced, they're going to send you back to the stables and tell you to balance it. They're not even going to let you attempt to ride in any kind of a balanced fashion in an unbalanced saddle. You can't do it very easily. In some cases, you can't do it at all. In most cases, you can't do it at all. So they're going to go back and they're going to add a little padding just in the front half of the saddle to raise it up and balance out the rider. Now, we're keeping our saddle where we want it for shoulder blade rotation. We're now balancing it out for the rider so that he can carry his weight in the middle of this tree and spread it out through the middle of the back, and it should then dissipate as we go toward the ends of the saddle. And it can't drop off suddenly, or we simply dig in if it drops off suddenly. It has to drop off gradually. The weight does, so that we carry a little more here and here than we do on the very ends. And that's called fan. It has to have some fan in the rear and some flare in the front. So you can also have the situation in reverse. You can have the front of the saddle too high, and you have to lift the rear of the saddle. A good rule of thumb, if you have a horse with a lot of dish in its back, like this one does, then we would add our padding from the midpoint and layer it forward. So we use a few layers of a thin material, no more than 1/4 of an inch thick. If we wanted to lift this saddle an inch in front, we were severely downhill on a horse, like a narrow horse, and wanted to lift it an inch in front, we would add a 12-inch spacer from here to here a 10-inch, an 8-inch, you see, and possibly a 6-inch of something like army blanket. And by doing that, we've stair-stepped our edges, we've maintained contact in the middle, and we've lifted his saddle up. And all of a sudden, it can start to ride balanced on the horse, and so can you. And you will not simply dig in to the front. You can do the same thing with the rear of the saddle. If the front's too high, you can bring the rear of it up to where you don't dig in to the back of the horse. So you see the amount of tinkering here that's necessary to make a saddle be balanced on the horse. That's a necessity with any saddle. It becomes a little less critical the more depth of sway we have in the seat. You see, this seat's not so flat. And all of a sudden, I can be a little high here or a little low and not have it be quite as critical, but it's still there. And if you're having a trouble with pinching in the front or digging into the rear and you know you're making contact in the middle, then what you've got to do is balance that saddle. What we use to make it easy for the owner to balance the saddle with is we, in the English model like this, we put in what we call lift pads or balance pads. And we look at your horse, a picture of your horse from the side, and we see how much he runs downhill if he does. In most cases they do. But a level horse is a desirable horse if you're looking for a horse to ride. So we look at that conformation, how much sway is in the back. If it's an average back, you'll only need lift in the front 8 inches of the spring panel on the saddle. Okay, and this will usually balance your saddle out. And then we may put 3 layers of lift in here. If it has a lot of sway in the back like this one, we'll drop it clear back into here and start our lift from way back in the saddle so we maintain contact in the middle of that horse's back. So this makes it a little easier for you. You do not have to have the extra layer of fleece in these booties. But essentially what we've done here is to make this saddle, and even our Western models, almost like an English saddle. At this point, we can change the shape of the saddle by simply changing the padding that we have inside. And we can add that lift to the front, okay, or we can take it out. Right now, there's just a 1/2 inch of the wetsuit neoprene foam in here. And if we want to put a little more padding on here because we have a very skinny, work-down, competitive horse that has a lot of bone showing, we add the extra layer of fleece. If we need to lift it in front, we lift it in front. If we need to lift it in back, you can stick anything in here to lift it with. It's not padding. Okay? This is stuffing that's going into the panel to change the contact to the horse. The same thing can be done fairly easily with the regular Western model. One of the things that becomes a real problem is rigging, whether it be English or Western. There's a very interesting recipe I read about for rigging a saddle in a book written at the turn of the century, published in London by a Canadian veterinarian and army officer in the cavalry. He said, rig your saddle with a V-shaped rigging and straighten the front edge of the V and have the rear edge going back. I read that, unfortunately, after I'd come up with this. It took me quite a few years to figure this out on my own. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to pull down the front of the saddle. Could you let that out all the way over there, the very last hole? We want to pull down the front of the saddle a little more than we do the back of the saddle. This is one of the biggest mistakes made in saddling. You have to pull down from the front edge of this tree, the very front edge of it. Anything else pulls your saddle forward on your horse. Okay? If we set a rigging, and I'll show you in a Western model in just a minute, if we set a rigging that's back here, and we tighten up with a girth that runs this direction, and you cannot arbitrarily girth back here. It doesn't work. This is a conical surface. It flares outward. You tighten up on it, the girth scoots forward, and it pulls the saddle forward. If it doesn't happen the first time, when you get on and it loosens up and you get off and tighten it again, it'll be up here. You can't get away from it. This is where it should be. This is where the very solid ribs are, the ribs that do not have the flexibility, the very first ribs that are tied into the sternum. Okay? And you have to girth there because that's not where the horse breathes. It doesn't affect his breathing very much. What you do with the rest of your rigging, though, can affect your horse's breathing. If we tie down tightly back here, we have these ribs with joints in them all along the top surface, down through here. And these ribs come out. We have muscles that expand them, okay? By contracting, they expand the rib cage, just like our own rib cages expand. If you sore these muscles through here with a saddle, or if you cut into this area with a girth or a rigging too tightly, you can have a problem. You also can have a problem with this serratus ventralis muscle right here that holds your horse up to the shoulder, because you can cut across it too tightly. So what we try to do with the rigging is to get it to where when we girth up, and I don't know if I can even get a hole started on this horse or not. When we girth up, we do not pull. Yeah, we can not only get it started, we can tighten it up. We do not pull the saddle forward. Whoops. No wonder I was having trouble. Ran through the wrong part of the buckle. Okay, you see what we've done here? We now have something that's pulling tighter from the front, and I've got to get it on an equal number of holes here. We actually offset these holes, these straps, so that the front strap cinches up a little bit tighter than the rear strap. We tie down in front, tighter than we do in the back. This back one just stabilizes the whole situation. Even when we loosen it a little bit, we're still tighter in front than we are in the back. And that's the way you have to be. If I don't do that, and I simply pull from the rear, I end up pulling the saddle forward, okay? So what we've done here with this rigging is quite unique, and we do this with a latigo cinch setup with a ring placed right in here for a latigo type rigging, or we do it with a single buckle. This is a 4,000-pound test chrome moly steel buckle with 2 tongues. The strength here is in the fact that the 2 tongues will take twice the pull before you rip through this strap that 1 will, so it works even for average roping. Will work for heavy roping, in fact. You can go ahead and tighten this saddle up, and it doesn't go anywhere. Saddle trees have to spread your weight over an area large enough that you carry no more than 1.5 pounds per square inch on the horse. A square inch, an inch by an inch. And if you take your weight, if you ride it anything more than a walk, you have to factor this by doubling your weight, because you're constantly pounding at the trot or the counter. You have up and down movement of the horse and up and down movement of your weight. You can't get away from it. So if we have a saddle tree that has 200 square inches of weight-bearing area here, we have a rider that weighs 200 pounds, and we take the rider's weight times 2, which is 400, and we divide it by 200, and we have 2 pounds per square inch. That tells us that we're going to cut off circulation in the skin, at least, of the horse. And it may go a little deeper if we ride the horse long enough. So what we have to have a little more weight-bearing area. You simply have to go to about 225 square inches, and you'll see a little difference in these trees. And you'll get to the point where you then carry your weight without digging in, and I say digging in, without cutting off circulation. That study was done by Equus Magazine and by some of the veterinarians associated with Equus Magazine. Anything over 1.5 pounds per square inch over any period of time on a horse's back cuts off circulation. When it gets to be greater than that, you cut off circulation deeper down into the tissue, into the muscle. And that's where your real damage is done. Simply cutting it off in the skin flattens the subcutaneous vessels, the veins, and when you take the saddle off, if you take it off fairly quickly, the horse is hot on its back. Say it's a reasonably cool day out there, whatever cool air hits that back, blood rushes back through those subcutaneous veins, and a lot of times it bursts them. And this gives you what would be called saddle acne, which can be little bitty bumps under the skin. It's an area of excessive pressure in just the skin. This happens a lot with thoroughbreds or Arabs or a fine-skinned, hot-blooded horse. Doesn't happen very easily with your cold-blooded animals. So this is where the old method of pulling a saddle off and cinching it off, first letting it loose just a little at a time, leaving it on the horse until the horse starts to cool out, and taking the pressure off gradually came about. It's the only kind of soring that you may prevent by doing that kind of unsaddling. You're not going to prevent any deep tissue damage or something like that. The pounds per square inch become very important because our most severe soring comes from cutting off circulation in the muscle. Now, it doesn't sound so bad when we say cutting off circulation, but when we say that we have a large death of muscle cells and tissue from cutting off circulation, it sounds a little worse. And it should, because that's what happens. You cut off circulation, you have living organisms die. You have muscle tissue that dies. And when you pull the saddle off, edema rushes to the area. And the edema that rushes to the area is there to repair that area. It's nature's way of starting repair in this area. And it starts, a bacterial action is started, and it helps to carry off the dead tissue. But you do this repeatedly, and that bacterial action can get started in live tissue. This is where fistula develops. This is where you actually have eating on the muscle all the way down through the shoulder, and oftentimes it takes place underneath the shoulder blade. And when you have this kind of thing, it can eliminate your horse. You can do surgery on it, you can cut it out, but it isn't always successful. We've saddled horses that have had this and that have had the surgery and done it successfully. But you cannot carry any pressure, excessive pressure at all, in that area that was damaged. If we start losing fit, okay, we can have a 110-pound rider ride this horse on this saddle, and it's going to sore. It is going to cut off circulation in a big way. And you can put a mound of pads on here, but you're just going to increase the area of contact a little bit. Okay? You'll not get away from your problem with just straight pads under this saddle until you've got so many there. You think you're riding the pad, and you just put the saddle up there for looks. Say, it's how thick they'd have to get. Well, let's talk a little bit about padding. We realize that we have to have contact with all of this weight-bearing area on the saddle, again, except for the very ends, so that they will have a graduated amount of lessened contact, okay, as we go off the horse. That's a long way around it, isn't it? And what we have to do is to go ahead and get that contact so we have the maximum weight-bearing area in square inches. What happens if we put a saddle on here and we have a little bit of a bad fit and we just pile on another pad and another pad? If you do that, quite often you end up pinching right in here because you're making this horse tremendously wider with the excess padding, and you're not changing anything here. Now, you raise this up some, but if it's a fairly thin horse and you're just padding him to keep from digging in here and here, you can pinch here. You have to be careful about that. Anytime you build up these pads like I was talking about, they should be down here on the area of contact of the bars, and they should not run on and up over the withers. It's much better that way. Now let me show you a little, quote, cowboy trick or two here about folding saddle blankets. And I don't know if I can do that with this horse, but we'll see what we can do. One of the things that you can do if your saddle rides too low in front, okay? You put your Navajo pad on or whatever you have, and this is something that will make do in a pinch, so to speak. and you can fold it back, okay, like you would normally fold it back. And you know that your saddle ride's too low on this particular horse. Say it's either a quarter horse that runs downhill, or it's a horse that's very narrow in front, like the last one we had that has a little of both. You turn around and you fold your pad back forward again. All right? Turn it around and you fold it back like that again. And what have we done here? We've changed the angle of the way the saddle will set on the horse. And we've raised it up in front some. It's going to take a tree like we had a while ago that was very level. It's going to make it run up a little bit. Okay? And that little bit of rise is what's probably going to set the rider, once you put pressure in this saddle, it's going to set the rider in the seat more balanced. So this is how you can just simply change something like that and see how it's going to work on your horse, and then turn around and go about building up a pad properly to make your horse operate better. A word about padding. This isn't padding. This nice squishy soft foam, it isn't padding either. Your other foams like EVA, horsehair felt, which we consider a pad, it's not padding. There's no way that that stuff pads a horse. If we spread the weight out over 200 square inches, or as in our spring panels, 400 square inches, and we're wanting to operate with 1.5 pounds or less per square inch, there's no way you can compress any of those materials. You have to have a material that compresses with a much lighter amount of weight. I can take something that's like a very soft neoprene pad and it feels just cushy soft. I put this pad onto a scale. I take a little block of wood that's a square inch in cross section. I set it on the scale and I push until I compress this ½ inch, 1/4 of an inch, just half of its freestanding height. Takes 35 pounds of pressure. The only thing this does in the way of helping a horse is when you have a gross misfit with saddling. And when I'm speaking of gross misfit, I'm speaking of something like that. Your neoprene pad helps a little bit because you're operating at a pounds per square inch that's out of this world with a concussion factor added in. Same with a felt pad. Now it becomes padding, but it pressures the sore of the horse anyway to cut off circulation in the tissue. So we end up back with good old fleece, whether it be sheepskin, hospital bed pad fleece like this is. You can set it on the same scales. You can take your inch block. You can push in with the inch block, and at about 1 pound, you'll have half of its freestanding height. So it works. We now have a cushion between us and the horse, and this helps the horse. Padding plays another role in the fact that it absorbs movement. It stops a certain amount of friction soaring because almost any horse will have a certain amount of movement between saddle and horse when you're riding. Excessive movement's going to soar your horse with or without pads. But the more pads and the more layers you have to absorb this movement in there, you see, the less friction you have that actually makes it through to the horse. 2 layers of fleece happen to act very well when they're placed like this, because if I put my hands on it, I can wiggle my hands back and forth and not move the middle at all. Okay? See what's happening here? That's why fleece works so well. And there is real bark tan sheep's wool on the hide that's washable on the market now. And we're starting to use it for booties, which is what we use in essence in lieu of a pad. The other thing that we do have, where you would typically pad up a saddle pad to raise your saddle in front so that it doesn't run downhill. Oops. We make what we call booties. And in this booty, I already have my lift pad in front. If it's too high in front, I simply pull them out. If it's not enough, I put more in, and you can use virtually anything you want. Now, we frequently see soaring that takes place on a horse, which is not really the result of saddle fit, and this is something called loin soreness, which is created from friction and movement and heat created from that. One of the things that can give you a problem in that is, again, having your saddle to where it rides. You said, okay, I realize I've been using my saddle too far forward. I'm going to go home and fix that. We go home to fix it, and we slide it back. Now, this saddle has a nice little rise here, and it's not going to ride too low on this wide horse. But on some horses, it would ride too low because it's a very wide tree. And our saddle drops down like this now. And again, we're back to the too heavy in front. Do you know what goes along with this? We've locked in to the movement of the front of the horse with all of the weight being placed on the front half of the saddle. Okay? This tree illustrates it better, I think. This is, we moved it back this hand's width behind the shoulder, and let's for sake of discussion say that we're riding like this, and our contact is in the forward half mostly. Then the front of the horse moves side to side very little, but the lumbar section of the horse has a lot of lateral movement when he's pushing off. We don't have those ribs in that part of the trunk. So the rear of the horse ends up moving back and forth underneath the saddle with very little weight on it. Usually it just breaks hair off, but with increased riding or a little bit of added weight, it starts soaring in the loin area. Another way to have loin soreness that doesn't have much to do with saddle fit, it all goes back to balance. Again, too high in front, whether we're up here or back here, if we're too high in front, we can have an excessive amount of movement, particularly when we're too far forward, and loin soaring. And this will give you the very sore kind in the heat bumps because it throws the rider's weight back against it. So just little things that you have to consider when you balance the saddle out on the horse. Panels on a regular Western saddle are called skirts, and they are simply one layer of leather on the top side that's wet fitted to the bottom of the bar of a saddle tree. Now, when you see 2 or even 3 layers of leather on the edge, you have to realize that this is what's left over out of a hide. That's what we call a cheater layer that goes into the skirt outside of the saddle tree to make it feel stiffer all around and more substantial. So when you get a new saddle, it's still a little stiff, and it does a little better job until it gets broke in and the leather gets like this and it doesn't really do anything. That's because you only have one layer of leather covering this rock-hard tree, and that's what you're dealing with. And it's just like this lady that bought this saddle, a goat ate this off, probably because it was the sweatiest part of the hide here on this used saddle. And it ate that off, and it just exposes this as being the saddle tree. That's it. That's wood under there. That's what you're riding on. You're riding on these trees I've been showing you. There is nothing else under a Western saddle that supports the horse. And this is what I couldn't understand when I started building my own saddle, and I put the heavy leather panels under here. I had the first saddle maker in Oklahoma City that saw it said, "Boy, you're going to sew a horse with that." You know? I said, well, I've already made it this way, and I'm going to leave it this way because it makes sense, and I just can't see riding on a bare tree. So that's what's underneath a typical Western saddle. And what you need to do in that instance is actually fit that tree to that horse so that hard weight-bearing area you have bears weight in the middle and doesn't dig in on the ends. Another reason for getting a rider's weight back to here, more into the middle of a horse's back, is that we simply have a surface we can carry weight on. All right? You can carry weight on a surface like this. Now what happens if we change that angle to this? Okay? Anything you put on top of this pinches it if you try to carry weight on it. It's just simple math. It pinches. There's no way you can get away from it. You put your weight up there, you're going to pinch. You're going to have a sore horse. It can fit like a T. It's going to pinch. Makes no difference. It's either going to pinch or you're going to have something riding right on the top edge of this bone right here, and that's even worse because you'll damage those spinal processes, and we're right back into having a horse that operates with dorsiflexion and a very sore back. What we'll go into now is checking for different kinds of soreness. Starting out with the basic premise, we have two kinds of soring to deal with. One being friction soring, which is caused by movement. The other being deep pressure damage, tissue damage caused by an ill fit. Okay, the friction soring is the one you see the easiest. It's the one that gets caught in the rides by the vets in endurance or competitive trail. It's very easy to see because when you run your fingertips lightly down the horse's skin, if we see, this really kind of feels good to a horse. But if we have any friction soring, he does this. Now, I've picked this horse for you today because he's got it. He was on a ride a week ago, and it was his first competitive trail ride. Okay? So we've really got it, and I can show it to you. See here? See how we drop there, and see how we drop here? This is not a normal amount of flexation in the horse. A normal amount would be something that was just a tiny bit of bending, okay? Just a tiny bit. Not this flattening of the croup, not this dipping of the back. That's an inordinate amount of reaction. We do have a little natural reaction back here on a horse, and we have some natural irritation to pinching in this area. But usually after the first few times you do it, it goes away. If it continues to take place and this old head comes up in the air, then you can know that you have a problem there. If you see these muscles contracted right here, you have a problem there. But back to the movement, why do I keep doing this? Well, because I can tell you from doing this that I have a rider that rides heavier on the right than they do on the left. Okay, so I can already tell you how the rider rides. They ride heavy to the right. I'm going to look at this horse. I've got a horse here with quite a prominent shoulder right there and with one that drops off here. You want to know why this rider rides heavy to the right? Because the shoulder won't support a saddle on the right. And now we have more of a saddle that gets picked up on this side and doesn't get the amount of movement on this side because it's setting down on the horse a little more. And so we have a loin that's sore over here because we actually have less contact and more movement on this side. So we've determined that we have a rider that rides to the right. They've probably been riding to the right if they rode this horse a long enough that if we actually shimmed up the saddle on this side and made it road level, the rider would still want to lean and carry to the right. It takes the rider a time to change. And this is extremely common. So the first thing we check when we see an inordinate amount of loin soring on one side as compared to the other, are our shoulders even on the horse's back? In this case, no. Now, we talked about this longissimus dorsi helping to regulate weight on the forehand and lift and laterally stabilize the movement of the horse. If you'll look at this back, and you can come and look at this horse later, you'll see that this whole back through here has more muscle development on that side than this side, because this side slopes away faster. That means that we have to lift in front, and then we have to lift throughout behind that to make a saddle just right even on this horse. There's another thing you get into here, and that's horseshoeing, and that is that this horse is going to need his right front foot built up, the left one kept as short as possible, and that will even out the shoulder conformation somewhat. It won't take care of this part of the back, though, okay? But it'll even out shoulder conformation. It'll make that horse work harder on his right side. So now we have a horse that's set up here to where even when he's out in the pasture, he's having to work on this right side, which he's trying to ignore and using the left side. So you can improve your horse tremendously by the shoeing and then by lifting the saddle on one side so that it no longer sets off to the right on this horse. So look at a horse when you buy him. Square him up. Get up over the top of him, over the rump, whatever. Make him stand square on his hindquarters, and then start looking at these shoulders. And there is a difference here. It's not a gross difference, but it's enough to take a situation in which the saddle was running downhill, locking into the front of the horse. The rear of it was popped up in the air and wiggling back and forth like this. Okay? Actually, the horse was moving under it. The saddle wasn't moving back and forth. saddle stabilized up here, and the horse is wiggling under it. Yet it had more contact over here because of the rider's weight, so it soared less here than it did here, which is where you get your tremendous reaction. So this is how you start playing Sherlock Holmes, by checking a horse's back. We're finding out a lot about the saddle and the rider already. We can look at this horse and we can say, hey, this horse is pretty narrow in front. Almost any saddle I put on here that were not very narrow in front with a tremendous rise to the seat would ride too low. Would very easily ride too low. See here? We no longer have a level seat. We've got a seat that runs downhill. Now, we can level it out like this, but that's going to ride on the shoulder blade. It's going to cause even more of an enlargement on this shoulder, which we have some of. See the head of this horse here? Okay? And it would cause digging right here. Right where the end of the bars were. See? This horse is not extremely sore in the rear. You see a tremendous amount of movement there. But after we've checked for this friction soaring, we're going to check for deep pressure soaring. The way we're going to do that is to simply apply a little pressure with 2 or 3 finger tips. And you'll see that I'm not hurting this horse's neck muscle. And that I'm not hurting this horse's rump muscle. Okay? And if I get back here, I probably will. See there? If I get right in here, I probably will, because they're all tight. Now we have to determine this is a normal reflex action, but I should not be able to drop the horse to the ground, or I should not have this much flexation quickly and easily. We've got soreness here, so we have to determine now, was it just friction soaring that gave us all this reaction, or did I actually have a tree that wasn't making contact in the middle of this back? Okay? So I'm going to go down through here, and I'm just going to use one hand on one side, and I watch the horse's head a lot, if you'll notice. And I'm going to watch his ears, and I'm going to get back into here, and I'm going to see what we have. Okay, the horse doesn't like this. He doesn't, so he's swishing a fly, he's turning around, he's giving us a little bit of a dirty look, and he doesn't like this tremendously. But what I am getting here is not a tremendous amount of pain, it's an irritation. Right? I'll guarantee you, if a horse is pressure sored here, he'll be walking over me. He will eventually simply walk to the side. And this horse is not moving, is he? He just forgets now in a little while that I've got pressure applied. Watch his ears. He's going to step over a little. He isn't quite forgetting it. All right, that's telling us that it's not a tremendous reaction, but we probably do have a little bit of excessive pressure back here along with the movement. Because we are not getting the tremendous action up in here, and that means that we obviously had a little less contact through this part of the saddle. So we've got a saddle that's probably making some contact here, but too much on the ends of those bars, like we showed you earlier. And we've got the movement problem. We've got a saddle that's dropping off to the right. Okay, so this rider needs to, and we've got shoulders that are, I think, quite sore here. But you know, very hard to check for the shoulder soreness. I can see that I have a tense muscle and pinching here. You can see that very easily. And we shouldn't get this much reaction out of a horse, but again, this is not as severe as I often find. So what we'll do, I'm raising the horse back up. This relaxes his top line. Remember, we said that these muscles through the back have to work relaxed. If they lock down, the horse stays swayed in his conformation. He has too much depth because these muscles lock down. What I'm going to do to check for shoulder soreness is to pull the shoulder forward. And I'm going to see what happens at the back of the shoulder where the saddle was. Okay? And we know that the saddle was either on the shoulder or right behind it. And when I press on this horse here, he wants to pull his leg away from me. He wants to move, okay? And he wants to go somewhere. And again, it's not as severe as I've seen, but he certainly doesn't like it. So we do have a little soring right in here, and the horse wants to dance around, kind of like he doesn't want to stand for a horseshoer. Let's see what it's like on the other shoulder, because see, that side's not carrying the amount of weight that this side is. You see I think a marked difference here. You see what's happening here? Whole horse is shaking. This is the sore side. This is the side that the weight was dropping off to. Okay? An inordinate amount was being carried over here. You see how much lower this is in here than what we have over here? It's very common. So if you want to put a saddle on a horse and see if it fits, what you need to do is to take your saddle, put it on your horse. Don't use a mound of pads, but just use some typical padding, okay? Put it where you regularly place it to begin with, and go ahead and stand in the stirrups. Mount, girth it up, mount, stand in the stirrups, and place a hand up underneath here like this while you're in the saddle. Imagine yourself being on top of the horse now with a hand under here. Have somebody on the ground, pick this leg up, stretch it out. If it pinches your hand, it's damaging the horse. I use essentially what's necessary for that horse. And I go up to about 15 to 17 pounds of pressure normally when checking. Now on this horse, I'm not having to use anywhere near that to get a reaction from this horse. Some horses are locked up through here. They've been operating this way for a long time, and that horse may not show you any initial signs of soreness. But when you look at these muscles, they'll stick out like somebody's biceps flexed like this, okay? They're going to stick out here all kinds of prominent, and you're going to say, boy, look at the muscles on that wither. You can't saddle muscles like that. You can't put a saddle on there without pinching. You'd have to build a big concave groove in the saddle bar to try to get around it. It just doesn't figure into the equation. You've got to relax that muscle before you can do anything. That horse is locking himself up and guarding his back. At that point, when this horse is locked up and you've got a huge bulging here, and usually you've got a very hard back muscle like this, all the way down through the back, okay? In that situation, that horse is extremely sore, usually internally. And he has this back locked up because the last thing he wants to do is to move it. And he's going to be as stiff as a board. He's not going to move it at all. He's not going to give you this flexion that we're getting from this young horse. You see that backbone bend? We're getting good flexion of the spine, okay? This other kind of sore horse I'm telling you about isn't going to give you any of that, and we'll look at some more in a minute. And some of them will be a little bit this way. And you have to break, if you want to ever treat that horse and get him back to good, you've got to break it up. So that's how you determine how much friction soring you have as opposed to how much actual deep pressure soring. Keep in mind, you pull a saddle off your horse after a good long day's ride, and you go to checking his back for soreness, he's liable to show you nothing. Next day, he's liable to drop down halfway to the ground. When you pull the saddle off, if you had a really ill fit and a tremendous amount of pressure, not the movement, which lights up the skin like fire, okay, but pressure, you simply deaden the tissue throughout the area. You get on a horse in the morning, second day of a trail ride, and he's cold-backed, and he acts up with you, and he gives you a fit. All right? 15 minutes out on a trail, I got him warmed up now, he's just fine. You go out and you get him out of his stall, and you don't put a saddle on him, you put him on a hot walker, and you walk him for 30 minutes. And you've loosened him up enough that you can get on him. He still takes another 15, 10 minutes to settle down, and that 15 minutes is simply deadening of this very sore area. And you get a dull amount of pain after a time after that, but it's a dull pain that they operate with, and they become sore throughout the shoulder and throughout the rear end oftentimes if it's bad enough in the way of a fit. The rear end actually having to work harder because the front end isn't doing its job. or because we're digging in here and it can't really operate either. So this horse is going to show you a reaction after the feeling returns to this area. You initially pull the saddle off. If you have pressure soaring, you can still get what I was talking about with the squeaky tissue, the fluid underneath, and the fingerprints staying in that area, okay? So you can still get that, and you can see that. The next day or whatever, you can start to see where the real damage was done, because he'll show pain then. Other thing that we have to do when we're checking the horse, if we want to kind of loosen him up, is to lift him a little bit. And by lifting, I just press on the abdominal muscles with the tips of my fingers, and he contracts it, and he lifts his back. Now, this horse will still lift his back. The old locked-up horse I told you about usually won't do this. He doesn't want any movement there. He wants things locked up so nobody moves anything. This horse lifted his back, and to do that, we had to relax these back muscles. They can't lift while they're contracted, okay? They have to relax somewhat. And you'll see a smooth transition now down this horse's back in an area of, a while ago, having a nice bulging muscle right here. You see it can take place quite quickly. All I have to do is get him tensed up in the muscle here, and we now have a slight bulge at the wither area. Dry spots typically are pressure points, and you have to, again, gauge dry spots, and you have to qualify the statement. The good question is pulling a saddle off and having dry areas there friction or pressure? It's pressure. Friction causes sweating. That's why the front and the back of your saddle pad always gets the dirtiest. That's why your horse always sweats up front and rear first, and not in the middle, unless you have a really unusual saddling situation. And it's a good question, because you can have dry areas after a reasonably long ride where the horse is not completely sweated over his rump or down the middle of his back. You can have dry areas that are simply from no contact, okay? But they are not matted down, and they do not look the same as a dry area from pressure point. Let's get one thing straight. When we're talking about real pressure and a pressure point, pounds per square inch on this horse, we can't have one any bigger than her hand, or it just becomes an area of very good contact with little movement, and your horse wasn't sweated thoroughly. You work him harder, he sweats thoroughly, that area will go ahead and become wet. And then you didn't have a problem. We get this kind of call a lot of times because somebody walks their horse for 2 hours, and it's not that hot, and he's hardly sweated. He's got a wet area everywhere but a patch from here to here with simply good contact. See? And if they went ahead and rode their horse hard enough that he actually sweated down the middle or on the rump, he'd be sweated throughout. But the dry spots you get from pressure is one that'll remain a lighter patch even if you hose your horse down. And we'll show you how to loosen him up even more. And you can do this to your own horse. But keep in mind, if you don't eliminate what's causing the problem, you're going to be doing more massaging than you are riding if you're not careful. You have things that are quite useful, like electric shock, treatment like that we have now. But think about it. We've got a muscle that's in contraction. Do we want to contract it more with electric impulse? Doesn't really make a lot of sense. We want to break up the spasm and the contraction of the muscle. The way this muscle manages on an older horse to stay contracted and to be in very severe contraction and what's called spasm is that the edema that rushes to the area after this area has operated under anoxia, which is this simply lack of oxygen. The edema that rushed to the area to repair it also acts as, quote, nature's cement. It actually helps set that contraction. And after repeated use can develop into a very solid spasm. This can be likened, have any of you ever woken up in the morning with your head like this? You couldn't get it off your shoulder. It didn't hurt as long as you stayed like this, but if you moved it, it killed you. Okay? It's nothing but a muscle in spasm. And that's what some horses walk around with, and that's why we can see a horse that's sore up here after 6 months and not being ridden. And it happens. For a year and not being ridden. It happens. Okay? So some people walk around this way the rest of their life, and some horses the same. What you want to do is to break up that spasm, so we generally go to a chiropractor or a masseuse or somebody that knows what they're doing to break up the spasm in our muscles. One of the best ways you can do this is with deep pressure massage. There's a book written by Jack Mars. He's a gentleman from Massachusetts. We carry this book in our shop. It's $12.95 postpaid. It's called Beating Muscle Injuries in Horses. It is very good. It's very simple, to the point. You have charts with all of the origin points of the muscles on the horse. Now what we're going to do is show you some of the areas that you would check for soreness in Jack's book. Initially, we would check right here, okay, for flinching, dipping, and so on. This is what he calls point 13, which is the attachment of the longissimus dorsi. We go up into these areas through here, and this is the trapezius and the rhomboid. See this horse's head? That's what we have here. You have to watch a horse's head while you're doing this stuff, because a lot of times they're going to show you a lot. And we do have some soreness up through there, but it's worse, I would say, right here. We see tension going throughout the shoulder with this. The way a horse can go lame on you and go sound 3 or 4 days later after you put him out in the pasture and you not be able to explain it, is simply that when this muscle doesn't work, this one has to work more, or it works too far and pulls too hard because this one's not resisting it. And this happens throughout the horse, the shoulder. We have what's called cooperative antagonism of muscles. The muscle on one side of a lever contracts. The muscle on the other side releases, but it doesn't release all the way. It releases partially, so that when this muscle contracts, it doesn't jerk and overflex and move too far with what we're moving. So when we have a muscle that gets very sore and deadened after a while, sometimes it loosens too much and you overflex an area. Or simply this stays in contraction and tense, and you sore this muscle that's contracting and trying to move the horse. And this goes throughout the shoulder and the neck. If we get a soreness in the base of this neck, which we do have right here, as you can see a little bit, see the horse jerk right here? Then that means that the origin of this muscle, where it attaches to its anchor point, is sore. It's not usually the belly of the muscle that gets sore, but the origin, its attachment. The insertion is at the end of movement. And normally we don't see the amount of soreness in the insertion, but we do have some, as we do at the attachment. We have areas through here. We talked about the serratus magnus. We have areas through here that get tensed up in a horse from just this original point in a saddling problem. We have what people call cinchiness right here. You see this horse move? This is not a cinch-sored horse. This is a horse with sore back. We relax this muscle, he'll lose half that reaction in 15 minutes. We see a horse that's sore down here at the point of the elbow. This one has not gotten far enough to be real tense and sore down here. That means that the tension has not gone throughout his shoulder and into his leg. When I walk up to a horse and I poke him right here at the point of the elbow on the triceps muscle, if he jerks violently down his body or through his shoulder, then he's actually limiting the travel to his deep major digital flexor tendon, which is the main pulley, the support pulley at the back of the leg through here. And it fans out into a couple of muscles here that it derives most of its travel from. Only 10% stretch in the actual tendon itself. The rest of the travel comes from, much of it comes from the muscle up here. A tendon can only stretch 10% of its length, so we have the rest of our travel that takes place in the muscle that it attaches to. If this muscle, if this triceps muscle is really sore, it tightens these muscles now because they're intertwined. And these muscles operate under tension. No longer does our suspension system work. Instead of a horse coming down on a stride with a good shock absorber, he comes halfway down. And the tendon and joint surfaces in the navicular and sesamoid area get sore and inflamed because they're carrying too much weight. this jamming hard trot instead of a fluid and a shock-absorbing trot. And your horse will go lame down there from being sore up here. Kerry Ridgway, one of the top endurance and sports equine vets in the country, made the statement that he feels that 75% or more of all lower leg lameness originates in the back. Now, we've already talked about interfering today. Now we're talking about lameness. It can also happen in the hindquarters from traveling back here with a real problem in the hind end. And the compensatory movement that takes place for this soreness through the back and the hind end can end up with lameness in the rear of the horse or tying up of muscles in the rear of the horse. So we have a tremendous amount of things that could be affected by a saddle. You have to have a relaxed muscle for this horse to operate. And see, this is not relaxed muscle on this horse. So you see this horse throughout his side. You see what's happening to him here and here. The pectorials down here are sore. We're still loose at the point of the elbow and the triceps, so that's good. We have the same soreness on the other side of the horse. So we've looked at a number of places that we need to do deep pressure massage on, one of them being down here for the neck, so that he can relax this neck some and drop it. Okay? And if we put enough pressure, and we're talking about 10 to 15 pounds of pressure here with the tips of our fingers, that's much more in pounds per square inch, because the tips of my fingers in no way make up a square inch. And this horse then will start relaxing this muscle after a little while. Essentially, we create a pressure point here. The brain sends histamines and other things through the blood to, number one, anesthetize the area, okay? Make it not hurt so much. And number two, to actually repair damage that might be taking place. So we're going to let the body go ahead and help repair some of the problem that we're having. Now, I'm going to go ahead and try to work both sides of this horse at once, but it's recommended that you do one at a time. And what I'm doing now is just the direct pressure. Now, in just a minute, we're going to go into cross-fiber friction, which means that our muscle fibers run this way, so we're going to work across them, okay, in a kneading action. And this is where the horse really feels it, okay? And I first use the pressure to slightly deaden the area, and when the horse gets too ouchy, I go back to the pressure. And then I knead in this area. Now, if I have a horse here with the spondylitis that we talked about earlier, he's extremely sensitive down the middle of his very backbone, the spinal processes. You got to be careful with this, because you're making the horse dorsiflect and damage those spinal processes even more. You have internal damage you need to take account of. And I would say in that horse, you're looking at a lot of rest and trying to keep his back up, not dropping it down any. But in this horse, what we're going to do is to try to make this horse relax this muscle. We're going to try to work some of the spasm out of the muscle. Okay? And see, our horse is putting up with it now because he has the idea that maybe this guy's going to stop poking around on me and do some more good than he has done. So, yeah, it's not all that bad. So our muscles start to relax, and I can feel them relaxing a little bit now. And if you don't think this is effective, try it on your partner. It really works. My wife cannot. She can walk all over my back. It normally doesn't do a thing. She can use this method, and I feel like somebody really did something, you know, instead of a fly playing around up there. Now, we're starting to relax the muscles some. Okay? We're going to go ahead and we're going to work this back a little more. It's a little harder doing both sides at a time. You have to be careful. You don't want to psych the horse out here and give him too much. They'll only stand so much pain, and it works much better to get this horse up against the side of a stall or something like that where you can work on him. He won't step away from you. Okay? I'm going to work one side at a time. We're seeing a horse earlier when it walked in here that would no more stand still for this than anything. You just saw the head drop just a little bit thin, and we're digging in with a good 15, 20 pounds, I'd say good 15 pounds of pressure right now on these 3 fingers of mine. You can use just your thumb. If you're a smaller person, a woman, for instance, stand on a bucket, use your thumb. Get your horse up against a wall or a stall, and you can use it, develop a tremendous amount of pressure on that one small point instead of using all of your fingertips. So we're doing this cross fiber friction, and we're starting to really get to this horse a little bit here. Oh boy. If you're a real good rider, you can ride with the looser girth #1 without getting a movement problem. You have to be in the seat a lot. You have to be light on your feet, carrying your weight in your thighs in the seat, and operating with the horse without much movement to do that. The further away from that ideal that you get, the tighter you have to use your girth, to the point that you cut off circulation in the horse's pectoral muscles. You can tighten your girth. When you start cutting off circulation in the pectoral muscles, then you have to loosen that girth, because you're simply going to have a massive swelling, a large lump. The horse doesn't show sensitivity to it, okay? And that's usually how you can tell if it were too tight a girth or not. If it's a very sore swelling, it can be from rubbing and fluid under the skin from excessive heat and friction. But that usually takes place with a loss of hair when you have that. So if it's the excessively tight girth, and you'll see this on barrel racers waiting around to take their turn and grabbing another cinch, you know, another hole in the cinch there, tighten that saddle down so it doesn't move under those 3 pads as they go around those barrels. And this horse stands there and he gets circulation cut off and he has a large swelling. That's right. Get that head down to the ground. You betcha. Okay, let's relax this a little now. And let's go ahead and give this area a little compression. And by compression, we're going to push and we're going to let go. Push and let go. We're going to do that down this muscle. And then just a little light massage in this area now. And again, this should be done one side at a time. I will do all that I can here. And you'll see that I'll push, I'll rub it, and I let go. I do all that I can here initially like this. And I can't take away that loin, the heat in the loin area of this horse right now, but with a little bit of this, we could improve it. A cold towel will do wonders for that right after it's happened. It's like putting your finger under cold water when you burn it. Okay, I pulled soreness out of a horse that wasn't quite this bad before a vet check in the middle of a ride with a cold towel and a massage. And I'm speaking of lots of cold water. And also, you can desensitize your horse and pull some of the soreness out of him when pulling the saddle off before a vet check in a ride. You see how little reaction we're getting out of this horse now? But we still got a tensed muscle here slightly, and it does take some work. We still got a knotted up muscle. And what I would do now after doing this is to work the other points that we had that still showed soreness at the origin of those muscles. So you're going to spend a good hour, hour and a half working on your horse. And then you're going to take it out, and you're going to exercise it, ride it lightly with a bareback pad or a saddle that didn't cause the problem in the first place. Remedy the thing that caused the problem, work on your horse, and then exercise your horse immediately afterwards. This little horse is starting to drop his head just a little bit, and he looks just a little more relaxed than he was a while ago. Quite a bit more relaxed. We've got a pretty smooth transition on this back now. And he's not going to be as jumpy and as spooky to work with, and he's just simply settled down a bunch. This is a hard horse to saddle. Looking at the downward slope of the back, the very narrow shoulders, the long back in the first place, becomes difficult to saddle. And that's why he's having a problem, in part. In part. You got to get it off this shoulder blade because it's been moved too far forward, pinching here, rubbing here, and wearing on these shoulders, and dropping off to the right. Lots of problems going on all at once. It's a very, very good case to show to you because we get to talk about a lot of things at once. It would be good to take the time to work on him one side at a time, to work on these other points, to get down here and to work on this one. And this one wasn't quite yet tensed. But boy, you'll see them that are. And you know what to do with it now. We apply deep pressure. We use the cross fiber friction. We alternate it and watch our horse. If the pain becomes a little too much with the cross fiber friction and he's not relaxing the muscle, back to the deep pressure. Do that for a good 10 minutes on any of these areas. The book gives you a definite prescription for each area. It tells you what the muscles do, the function they play, the name of them, where the origin is, and so on. When you get through with that, you do some compressions, okay, down the length of that muscle. Really makes a lot of difference in your horse. You can see that this horse looks like he's got a very prominent muscle right here. And this led me to immediately believe that he might have a little problem. He's got a high set of withers, okay? You have to have a good deal of width to not only clear the withers, but not to pinch right here in a saddle. Too many saddle makers ignore the high withered horse anymore. And so what a rider has to do is put on another pad to try to keep the saddle from riding right on the withers, and you end up then simply pinching a little more down here. Okay? Come on. Okay. And we've got a tough old horse here, and that's a tight old muscle, and it's a pretty tight back, and he's got a short back, and that's good. It's real good. What we've got to do is to just, if you use a little of this deep pressure, a lot of times you will start having the horse react to a little bit of what is really there. We don't like to see that knotted up muscle there. I'm going to lift him a little bit. See, this guy doesn't want to lift his back. You notice that this back doesn't come up like that other one? Not at all. I come back here, and he doesn't want to dip his back. Okay? We're not seeing the normal amount of reaction in this horse in either phase. And yet we're seeing a very tightly contracted muscle and a horse that's acting up. So you say, well, you're trying to push a point and you're trying to make it look like every horse is sore. But I should have more reaction from this horse that I'm getting. I can't get him to do hardly anything, okay? And yet I can't lift him either, you see? So we're not getting a normal amount of reaction in his back. We're getting a tough old burger that's standing here gritting his teeth. He's saying, hey, I'm not going to move. It hurts to move. So this is the opposite reaction that you look for. See? It's absolute absence of natural movement and a tensed and a locked muscle. So this is as good of an example as you could get in a horse that doesn't look like he has any problem. He's just tighter than the dickens right here. See it? And he doesn't want to move that back. Now, I guarantee you a regular horse would be lifting his little tummy right now and his back, and he would be dropping it somewhat with me working on him right here. And I would say that it would take an excessive amount of pressure for me to get him to really react here. And we know we can get him See, we got him to react more here earlier. See, he's very guarded now. When I touched him before back here, he just dropped when he walked in earlier. So he knows what I'm going to do, and man, this back is locked up. We're not going to show you anything. Absolutely textbook example, and this does come out of the textbook for palpating a back and checking the horse that is really tight and is guarding himself. So it makes it very difficult to diagnose. From a young horse that we saw a while ago, which looks like an overreactor, to a horse that's been ridden a lot and used a lot that now is an underreactor and gives us the same diagnosis in part, and the pinching right here especially. I don't think he's been dug into a lot back here, but she said he has had some problems back here. And absolutely won't move to it at all. And Linda will tell you that earlier, boy, he about dropped when I did this. See? So if you can't get any natural reaction, any horse you can take and massage down the back like this and get them to flatten their croup and stretch their whole back. It's a good exercise for them. To work them, to knead them, and to get them to flatten that croup and to tense and stretch that whole back, and then lift them back up from the bottom. But this old boy says, you're not moving me anywhere. So it's a very good example of a horse that's dealing with a lot of pain, and he says, I know how to take care of it. I just do not move this area, and it doesn't hurt. Okay? I do. Oh, boy. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. We should get some kind of reaction of some kind out of this horse. When I'm not, what it means when we're not getting any reaction. We can't not only not get a reaction, we don't get natural movement. That means that he's guarding himself. He's not allowing any movement, and it keeps you from him from experiencing any pain. When he walked in, he was not expecting me to go down his back, and when I hit this area, he damn near dropped to the ground. And now we have a situation to where he's guarding it. If you really want to work on this horse with that deep pressure massage, I'll guarantee you this horse will go bananas. Okay? All we have to do is a little of the deep pressure massage, and it will get past this horse's pain threshold, and you'll start seeing this horse then react, and it opens a can of worms, and you've got to continue it, or your horse is going to overreact for some time until he, quote, locks his back up and starts guarding it again. But he is doing one whale of a job. And again, we're not getting him to lift. We're getting him to lift a tiny bit now, but not hardly any at all. And we should have a reflex action from right here dropping the croup. Okay, and we've gotten him to do that. So we're getting a normal reaction back here. But we're not getting any normal reactions anywhere through here. So this is another example, and we'd have to work on him with that deep pressure massage for quite a while, and then he'd be a real touchy horse until you got the problem worked out. Here's something that you have to keep yourself from doing, folks, once you leave here. You cannot go up to people and say, hey, man, can't you see your saddle doesn't fit? You can't do that. You just are going to get in trouble. You've got to bite your lip. And you've got to be very, very, very low-keyed about saying anything to anybody. And you can suggest something to somebody, but take it easy when you leave here. I found a long time ago that you just can't go up and tell somebody that their saddle doesn't fit. Okay? And what you'll learn today, you can go up and tell somebody, mind if I look at your horse's back? You know, if he doesn't mind and you look at it and he wants to know what's happening and you want to tell him, then that's fine. But don't go out there and be pushy, because it won't do you any good.
This completes part 2 of the Mechanics of Saddling video series. Let's review the information learned. In part 1, Lynn Brown discussed the history of saddling, mechanics of the horse, rider's impact on horse equilibrium, where to position the saddle, and the natural seat. In part 2, Lynn covers saddle construction, tree and saddle fit, rider balance, rigging angle and position, weight-bearing area and pounds per square inch, the role of padding. He demonstrates how to palpate the horse's back for soreness, how to assess the fit of your saddle, and how to perform deep muscle massage. For further information about saddle fit or the patented Orthoflex saddle, call or write Brown's Performance Saddles, area code 417-667-7834.